Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne Hardy, who is the line editor for Rivers of London and an associate editor for Call of Cthulhu, and I asked her to tell us about a day in the life of a TTRPG writer. I started off the interview by asking Lynne exactly what a TTRPG writer is. I'll jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.
A TTRPG writer is someone who, funnily enough, writes for TTRPGs. So that might be really one of two things. Either they're going to be writing a scenario of some sort, or they're going to be writing setting material of some sort, or they might be doing a mix of both, depending on the project that they're actually working on.
Can you walk us through just an average workday for you? What does it look like?
It depends on what stage I am at in a project. So if I'm at the beginning of a writing project, my typical day is going to involve research. What areas am I interested in? What themes am I looking at? So I'll go away and I'll do research. I'll read books. I mean, you can see the bookshelf behind me, which has got lots of books on that have been involved in research for various projects in the past. I use the internet. I'll, try and track down things on there, which may lead me to further books for research. If I'm feeling like a day out, certainly in the before times, I used to go through to the Lytton Phil in Newcastle and go and have a wander around their books. It's the largest private library outside of London. And it's been there for a couple of hundred years. So they have a wealth of very old books, particularly old travel books, which are really useful for going and looking at different parts of the world in around the eras that we're interested in for Call of Cthulhu. So yeah, if it's the beginning of a project, it will be research, and that's reading things, making notes, writing through ideas. I tend to sort of fill notebooks full of little conversations with myself about things that could be useful, things that could be interesting, things that could be potentially developed into something more. Once I've done the bulk of the research, then my day will change and it will be sitting in front of the computer typing. Now, normally I like to have a fixed idea in my head of roughly what order things are going to be going in before I start typing things up. But sometimes certain scenes will be at the forefront of my mind, so I'll get those written down. And sometimes that's a good way to get started because it can be quite intimidating staring at a blank computer screen that you've got to fill. And every now and again, it's just a case of just get something down there, just so that you've got a beginning. You've broken your duck, you've got going. So then if I'm working on a writing day, it'll be write, review, write, review, write, review. I normally like to keep a check on how many words I'm doing a day, just so that I've got an idea of the progress I'm making towards my target. And then inevitably, as you're writing, you discover that your research isn't as good as you thought it was. So you have to go off and do a little bit more to just back up particular areas. And sometimes as you're writing, things start to click in your subconscious mind that you hadn't really thought about that you'll also need to go off and do some research on. So, like you said, it's kind of two distinct phases, but you will always get blending of the two of them at some point in a project as you're refining your ideas and bringing them all together.
You've given a cool answer about the kind of things you do in terms of research and in terms of writing, but I think that people still might not necessarily know what those things look like. If somebody were to be following you, watching you over the shoulder, what would they see you actually doing? What does that process look like at the most granular level?
Well, for the research stage, it will generally involve me looking quite often at travel books. So if there's a particular area that I'd like to set a scenario, I'll see if I can get an old travel book and I'll order it off the internet. Secondhand is usually great. It's not like I need the most up-to-date one. I don't need to know how much the hotels are going to cost now because, let's face it, I'm writing in a historical period. What the hotels cost now is completely irrelevant. But travel guides frequently have cool locations, interesting snippets of folk history and things in there. So then I'll get my travel book and I'll ensconce myself downstairs on the sofa, or at least these days, actually, it's on the bed because my husband uses the sofa as his office now when he works at home. And I'll have a notebook and I'll have a fountain pen and I'll have the travel book and I will go through and I will make notes for things that interest me. that could be useful. That's then my starting point to go away and do more research. So I'll look up those specific topics. Quite often I'll start on the internet looking up specific places or legends. Then I'll see if I can track down books that go into more details, that are more focused, and let's face it, are probably a lot more reliable because they've been researched. Quite often I'll be looking at older books. And again, quite often I'll get them secondhand because I don't need brand new versions. Often a lot of the books that I use will be out of print anyway, so they're secondhand. And again, as soon as that turns up, I'll read them. I will not necessarily make notes as I'm reading them. Let me get one out to show you the amount of ridiculous things I do. So I'll quite often read a book, and you can see that lots of little tabs in there. And then once I've read the book, I will go back and make notes, because I just sometimes find that's a bit faster than me constantly making notes as I'm actually reading. So yes, it's usually sitting somewhere with a big cup of tea and a book and a notepad and a fountain pen, making notes about what I'm interested in. At the granular level, once it switches to the writing, it's me in the writing hovel, typing away on the computer. I've got a little book stand next to me on my right hand side that will have my notebooks on open so that I can just turn and look at them. I will frequently have typed up my notes into a Word document because that helps me to refine them even further. So my notebooks have got everything that I think might be interesting and useful in. And then I'll type those up, and that's when things start to fit together as the jigsaw puzzle. And I'll not necessarily type up all of my notes. I'll type up the bits that seem the most relevant, the most interesting to what I'm trying to do. So I'll have my notebook open to my right. I'll have the Word document open with my condensed notes. And then as I use bits, as I'm typing them in, to make sure that I know that I've used them, I'll actually put a line through in the Word document or a little tick in my notebook to see that I've covered things that I believe are important, that I know I want desperately to include. And I'll also be thinking about, what sort of artwork do I need if I'm writing a scenario? What sort of handouts do I need? What sort of maps? And keeping an eye out for things that need to be on them that are going to be critical to help support the scenario or the setting material. And then it's just typing. It's very boring. I'll be sitting here typing away sometimes with music on, sometimes not, depends on my mood. Usually movie soundtracks or computer game soundtracks, nothing with vocals. I can't write when I've got songs with words because I tend to sing along. I tend to keep those for when I'm sort of shuffling things round and sort of like looking for images to help support whoever's going to be doing the artwork and things. But yeah, normally, like you said, once it's the writing phase, it's sitting at the computer, occasional wanders downstairs to pop the kettle on and make myself a cup of tea so that I'm getting up and moving around. And then just, getting on with it, which is quite often the hardest part, attempting not to be distracted. Thankfully, my office is north facing with a little window that is quite high, so I can only see the rooftops over the way, so I can't get too distracted by the outside. But it is quite difficult sometimes when it's a beautiful, bright, sunny day and there's blue skies and I can hear the birds singing outside, wishing that there was some way I could go and sit in the garden and work. But, sometimes you can do that on a research day, and that's really nice. But yeah, it's just like any other job in a lot of ways. You just have to get on with it and get it done.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about this writing process. Can you tell us a tiny bit more about what it looks like? Are you a quick writer, or are you a slow and methodical writer? Do you take breaks? How much will you get through in a day?
Oh, that's the how long is a piece of string question. On average, once I start writing, once I get into the flow of it, I can usually, I was going to say bang out, but that's not quite the right word. I can get 2,000 to 3,000 words down on paper a day. At the best, I think I've managed 8,000 pretty much usable words in a day, but that was when I was really on fire and I knew exactly what I was writing. So yes, on average, we're talking 2,000 to 3,000 usable words a day. Which will get refined every day because I like to check first thing in the morning before I get going what I've actually written. Obviously, with a big campaign, you can't do that. That's ridiculous. You'd spend the entire day reading it. But, if it's broken into chapters, I still like to know what I've written, because quite often you kind of get into this weird mental state where you're almost not entirely conscious of what you're writing. It's kind of doing it itself. So you have to keep checking to make sure that you've mentioned the things that you needed to mention, and you're not just saying the same thing over and over again, which can happen once you kind of descend into the zone and you're just happily, your fingers are flying over the keyboard. I mean, I'm a reasonably fast typer. I'm not a desperately accurate typer. I didn't get to do typing at school because it clashed with A-level physics, which was slightly more important. And that was back in the days when we actually did have a classroom full of manual typewriters, and you could take your oh, I can't remember what the exam board was now, but you used to be able to take your typing things, and I thought that would be a really good skill to have. But like I said, it clashed with A-level physics, which was distinctly more important for me getting to university.
A lot of people will agree that their job has changed pretty significantly over the last couple of years. Has your job changed recently?
Well, as I said, my husband now most of the time works from home. He occasionally has to go on site, but he has claimed the sofa as his office. So if I'm doing research now, I don't tend to go down there and sit on the sofa and do the research, because I don't want to get in his way. So it's usually, if it's a nice day, I might be out in the garden, but most of the time I'll be upstairs in the bedroom doing research. So I'm away from the desk, just because I don't have a very big desk and there's not a lot of space for sort of having my notebooks out and everything spread around. I do like to spread out when I'm researching, so I've got things all around me. People have been insatiable over the lockdown, it has to be said. There's been a very high demand for things. So if anything, we're working harder than ever. So yeah, I don't get to write as much as I used to for various reasons, most of them being like associate editor for Call of Cthulhu and line editor for Rivers. But I have been writing the odd scenario over the last couple of years, and it's interesting because I'm used to editing and helping plug the holes in other people's scenarios, or plug the leaps of logic. But it has been very interesting actually going back and starting from scratch and writing whole scenarios again for something other than a convention. I mean, I've written lots of convention scenarios over the last few years, but it's very different writing one of those, because you don't need to have everything in place and full working order because you're running it. You can fill in the gaps as you're going. But if you're writing something for publication, then you have to have all of those gaps filled in, because the person who will eventually end up running it doesn't have your background knowledge, doesn't know what you know. You have to give them that information. So it's been quite fun, but quite a challenge on occasion. So sometimes my word count was not the 2,000 to 3,000. It was maybe 500 to 1,000, because yeah, sometimes it was quite difficult to make the words come out in the right order.
So being a TTRPG writer, who do you talk to? Who do you consult with? What are the people that you talk to about what direction a scenario should go in, what changes you should make, things like that?
First and foremost, whoever's commissioning you, you need to be able to quite often give them a pitch. This is my idea. This is what I want it to do. So that will usually probably involve what I would call an elevator pitch. It's 1 or 2 sentences, which very clearly states the key goals of that particular scenario, followed by a couple of paragraphs, which describes what the investigators or the adventurers or whoever they are going to be getting up to. Obviously, you then talk to the line editor or whoever's commissioned you to refine that further so that it fits with what they need, because your idea might not necessarily fit with what they need exactly. So it's this dialogue backwards and forwards to make sure that you're providing them with what they need. For me personally, quite often, like you said, I'll have a conversation with myself in the pages of my notebooks about what I think is going to work. I will bounce ideas off Rich, my husband, because he's very good as a sounding board and asking all the questions along the lines of, but what if, but how does that? So he's very helpful for helping me formulate ideas and refine where things are going. And again, you'll be talking to your editor about how things are developing, whether if you have a problem about how to handle something, you'll be talking to them, getting their advice on how you can deal with that, how it's been dealt with in the past, so that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel basically for certain things. because you can't expect a writer to know absolutely everything that's ever been published for a game that's been out for 40 years. And quite often things have been done before in a particular way that you don't necessarily want the writer contradicting in any way. So yes, I mean, it's mostly going to be whoever you trust to bounce ideas off your sounding board. I mean, that might be your gaming group. Certainly, if you're writing something, you should, for like a scenario, you should be playtesting it to make sure that it's doing what you think. So you're going to be talking to your playtesters to get their feedback, their ideas as to how to improve what you're doing. And yeah, it's those are really your kind of three main touchstones. It's whoever you normally bounce your ideas off when you're doing these things, your playtest group, and the person that you're working for, so that you know that you are not leaving gaps that are obvious to you but aren't obvious to other people, and that you're actually providing your commissioning agent with what they need.
What is the best and worst part of the job? That's a classic question for you.
That is a classic question. Thank you. Well, I suppose the best part of the job is, yes, I suppose it's the research side of things. I love learning new, weird, interesting things. So actually having an excuse and getting paid to go learn weird, new, interesting things is fabulous. Not all of it is fun or enjoyable. Certain of the historical periods that we're looking at, there's some pretty dark stuff going on, but it's still interesting. It still informs what you're writing. So that I absolutely love that. The hardest part, sometimes it is just the fact that you are on your own in front of a keyboard, typing away, pretty much in isolation to the rest of the world. I mean, I laughingly call this the writing hovel, but there have been times when I've barely left the house for days on end, from one weekend to the next, if I've got my head down on a project. So it can be quite isolated, which is why the recent advances in things like this, sort of like being able to do video conferencing is great, because it does at least still mean that you can communicate with people and you're not just locked in your tiny little hovel with your own thoughts.
I'd like to ask you for advice about being a TTRPG writer. There's a couple of times that we've talked about the pathway to do that, and that's kind of a different video. So to close off, do you have any advice for people who find themselves as a TTRPG writer and want to improve? What do you do when suddenly you're in the middle of it?
Well, as with pretty much everything, you improve by doing. You practice. You just. I mean, it sounds terribly trite, but it kind of really is the only way to improve. Is write, read, read lots of things. Don't just read the things that you're working on. Read widely, because I come from a very strange generation. I come from a generation that was not actually taught English grammar at school because it was deemed that we would just somehow absorb it from everything around us. So, and it's kind of true. If you read widely, if you read a lot of books, you will pick up on ways of saying things, ways of presenting things, ways of structuring things. If you read outside the field that you're interested in, so if you read, so say, let's take Call of Cthulhu as an example, horror. So if you normally read horror, why don't you go and read some mysteries? If you normally read mysteries, why don't you go and read some horror? Because you're going to be able to see how different authors put different ideas together, and that might just be what you need to give you the spark. Don't be afraid to go out and visit places. Going out and physically going to somewhere, to a location, can be immensely valuable if you have that opportunity. Not everybody does. But if you do have it, take it. Because reading about somewhere will only get you so far. I've written a scenario for an upcoming Gaslight collection, and I'd read lots about the location that it's set in, but I had the opportunity to actually go and visit it and take photographs and walk around it. And that made a difference, because even the best written sources will have missed out something, and they can't necessarily always convey the atmosphere of a place, which, if you're writing a scenario, particularly horror ones, you need to get atmosphere across because it's a foundational part of what you're trying to sell. Don't forget to make use of your local libraries. Sometimes you can get hold of books secondhand, but again, that can get quite expensive depending on the project. Use your library. They're wonderful resources, and librarians are great. They'll be able to help you find what you need. Read widely, visit places, get sunshine and fresh air. And if you need a break, take one. Go do something different for a bit. Brains don't like being forced to do the same thing, for hours and hours at a time. And if you're stuck, it's usually because that's all you've been focusing on. So just pop it to one side, walk away, let it just sit there and stew for a couple of days, because quite often your brain will be working subconsciously away on the problem, and then you'll come back to it and you'll be able to see more clearly because you've just left it for a little while, and things will hopefully fall into place.